The war on drugs led by the United States is a term applied for hardline policies aimed at the elimination of drug use in our society. Most Western countries, like the UK, Australia and New Zealand, have similar laws in place. The criminalisation of drug use is now over 100 years old. It got me thinking, is the war on drugs having the desired effect of minimalising drug abuse? In order to evaluate this idea, I needed to find out the history of the war on drugs and its effect of drug abuse in the US. Has the war on drugs been successful in reducing drug use in the US, and what are the alternative measures that could be taken instead? The war on drugs is credited to have started in 1971, when Richard Nixon declared war on drugs and proclaimed America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new, all-out offensive. However, its real start could be said to have started in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act, which were the first anti-drug policies in the United States. That bill set out the first banning of drugs and set up the start of further anti-drug legislation that was to come. Then came the Boggs Act of 1951, which established mandatory minimum federal sentences for possession of marijuana, cocaine, and opiates. In 1973, saw the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency, which was charged with the control and eradication of the drug trade. These mandatory minimum sentences meant that even in non-violent drug charges, a minimum sentence would have to be served. This resulted in mass incarceration in the United States. The goal of the war on drugs is to create a world without drugs by eradicating drug supplies and prosecuting drug traffickers, dealers, and manufacturers. The problem with this logic, however, is that it ignores one of the most basic economic principles of supply and demand. When you cut the supply and the demand remains the same, the price goes up. Drugs are a commodity that will be consumed no matter what. These hardline policies have not seen any changes in successive governments, which leads to the question, have these policies even been successful in their goal? The answer to this question is quite difficult to answer, as it's hard to get any real data on the issue, as it relies on self-reporting. If you ask those for prohibition, they would state that it is, while if you ask those against, they would state that it isn't. Even the data is split on the issue, with both camps citing conflicting studies. The use of hard drugs, meanwhile, has remained roughly stable over the last 2 decades, and about 40% of high school seniors admit to having taken some illegal drug in the last year. There is also a study that claims, in 2014, an estimated 27 million Americans aged 12 or older were current, past-month, illicit drug users. However, the prohibition camp also has data to quote, such as, there is a percentage currently using illicit drugs in OECD countries are generally below 1% of the population, except cannabis, where most are between 3 and 10%, of which the United States is included in. Controls and prohibitions help to keep prices higher, and higher prices help keep user rates relatively low, since drug use, especially among young people, is known to be sensitive to price. These relationships between pricing and rates of young substance use is well established with respect to alcohol and cigarette taxes. There is literature showing that increases in the price of cigarettes trigger declines in use. A rebuttal to this argument could be that the higher cost of drugs forces manufacturers to cut their drugs with other drugs, thus making drug use more dangerous. I've concluded that due to the more overwhelming evidence on the side against prohibition, that the drug war has not been successful in reducing drug use in the US. The success of the drug war is such a difficult thing to measure, with a prohibition supporter citing the number of drugs seized and arrest records, while those against cite the amount of drug users. I've come to the conclusion that the war on drugs has had little effect on drug use in the United States, purely for the fact of the amount of data on drug use is cited towards the anti-prohibition argument, and the knowledge that drugs will be consumed no matter what. So trying to stop people taking them and throwing them in jail as often happens. Instead, we need to look to more health concern-based policies rather than treating addicts like criminals. Now that I know the history of the drug war and concluded that it's not a successful policy in terms of reducing drug use, I began to wonder if there were any alternative policies in terms of drug policy. What I found was there are a range of alternative policies other than prohibition, ranging from full legalization to harm reduction policies. One of the oldest alternative drug policies in the world is that of the Netherlands, who have much softer drug laws, most notably regarding the use of marijuana, where there are licensed premises that serve marijuana. One study found that lighter enforcement does not lead to more drug use. About 25% of Dutch citizens reported having used marijuana at least once, which is on par with the European average. In the comparatively strict United Kingdom, that rate is 30%, and in the United States, it's 41%. Opponents to the Dutch policy to marijuana don't understand the logic behind coffee shops, which is to give smokers a safe place to smoke. So we see that it is a potential policy, and is a policy that has lasted for just under 40 years. However, there are many other policies. Another policy is that of Switzerland, who have a policy of harm reduction, which is that of allowing addicts a place to use, access to clean drugs, and access to social workers. The success of which is 70% of the 20,000 to 30,000 opiate or cocaine users in Switzerland now receive treatment, one of the highest rates globally. The use of this policy, which allows drug users to get help in order to stop using, or at least not use compulsively. The most liberal policy is that of Portugal, who decriminalized all drugs in 2001. Decriminalisation is the policy of allowing possession of drugs, but manufacturing and selling remain illegal. The policy has been around for over 10 years. Before it was implemented, drug use was through the roof. Crime rates were relatively high, and HIV rates were high as well. However, now, the number of teenagers who have at some point taken illegal drugs is falling. The number of drug addicts who have undergone rehab has also increased dramatically, while the number of drug addicts who have become infected with HIV has fallen significantly. After looking at alternative measures, it is not clear as to what the best is. However, what I've concluded is that drug addicts need to stop being treated as criminals and instead be treated as having the illness that they do. What they need is not to be thrown in jail, but rather to be helped into a position where they can look after themselves and focus on their sobriety. In conclusion, the war on drugs has long been the heart of the drug policy of the United States. It has gone many years without being criticized. However, it is only relatively recently that people have begun openly discussing the idea of drug reform. I believe it is time that the United States should cease the war on drugs, wave the white flag, and have a rethink, with a policy that protects those most at risk by not excluding them and painting these people as criminals, but rather allow them to get better so they can contribute to society. We must never forget that a true man will listen to anyone, no matter how old or young, for everyone has a story to tell and a lesson to teach.